We are going through the Gospel of Mark this year, and we are in chapter 2. We left off last week after Jesus had healed a man whose friends had lowered him down through the roof, and Jesus took mercy on them, and he forgave this man. And we're going to pick up the story there. We're in Mark chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 2. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people had heard that he had come home. And they gathered in large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door. And he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. And since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it and then lowered the mat the man was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, that's where we left off last week. Now, some of the teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this is what they were thinking in their hearts. And he said to them, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat, and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to this man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone. And they praised God, saying, "We've never seen anything like this." Verse 13. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake, and a large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciple, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Jesus answered, "How can the guest of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? They cannot, so as long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. Jesus said this, "No one sews a patch of unshrunken cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. No one pours new wine onto old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." I don't mind admitting this to you. I love Jesus. I think you should just know that. I'm just going to show my cards right up front. I love Jesus. Not in the way that like a lot of religious folks say it. I think this cat is hilarious. I think this character that gets portrayed to us, that's presented here in the gospel, is so interesting. And one of the things that sort of helps me, because a lot of times when people talk about Jesus or when they're like reading or quoting him, they're so sincere that I think we miss some of the playful prophet that gets presented to us in texts like this. One of my favorite books that came out of the men's movement of the 70s and 80s was a book called Warrior, King, Magician, Lover, The Archetypes of a Man. And I love this book. And one of the things that I am very aware of is that when some people either talk about Jesus or when they like read the Gospels or they think about Jesus, they view him very much in sort of this archetypal way where some people really do picture Jesus and portray Jesus as a warrior, right? And so he is this powerful character. And it's important because when you read sections of the text like we read today, how you read the spoken parts where Jesus speaks, if you're picturing somebody who is physically strong and commanding, right, it comes across in a very specific way. So some people picture Jesus as a warrior. Jesus often gets portrayed as a king. And so there's this stateliness, he's very composed and upright, right? There's a very kingly way that he carries himself. And then some people picture Jesus as a lover. And so he's very tender. There's that famous picture of him holding a lamb. I can't tell you over the years how many times I've been given a picture of Jesus holding a lamb, either on a card or like Pastor's Appreciation Month, somebody will get me a framed picture. We're pretty good at picturing Jesus as a lover, being a very gentle, kind person. The Jesus that interests me the most, though, is the magician. Because when I read the Gospels, Jesus sounds a lot more to me like the Riddler than Batman. Jesus is always messing with the authorities, asking questions they can't answer. And so though I do get the archetypal thing of Jesus as a warrior or Jesus as a king or Jesus as a lover, it's actually Jesus the magician or the playful prophet that gets my imagination going. And so how I like to come into this is I often ask people, like if we have a Bible study and we read a section like this, I'll often ask people, if this were a movie, who are you picturing playing Jesus? Like what famous actor that we would all know do you picture delivering these lines? And people answer, like the leading men of the day, right? Whoever it is. And they're usually handsome and well-spoken and, straightforward. And that's fine with me, whatever, I don't care. But there's something about it that just doesn't sit right with me. It doesn't resonate with me that you would have, the leading man, and he's so straightforward and predictable. Because when you read the actual Gospels, Jesus is much more twitchy. He's quirky. He's always messing around with those who are in power because he's not in power. And so I always like to present different types of characters and read Jesus in those voices. For instance, I would like to see Danny DeVito portray Jesus in a movie. That would be of great interest to me. He's just quirky enough. He's a little unexpected. I think he would do a great job in a situation like this where the religious authorities of the day they confront Jesus and they say, hey, who do you think you are? What are you doing? And Jesus doesn't say, how dare you, right, and claim his own authority. He plays a word game with them. He says, all right, hold on. What's easier? To say your sins are forgiven, that's one thing. I just said one thing. Or to say three things. Take your mat, get up, and walk. See, it's just an economy of words. I just said the easier thing, your sins are forgiven. Right? He's playing a word game with them. He's not even answering their question. And in this sense, I think Jesus is a lot more erratic or unpredictable or a trickster, if you will, in literature. And so I'd be interested in, say, a Christopher Walken. I'd like to hear him, play Jesus in that quirky way that he delivers lines. I was thinking of a whole bunch of actors this morning who might do a really good job. And I was thinking about the show The Office, the very popular show. It's not the Steve Carell or character or the Dwight Schrute, I should say, character that I think would do a job. Certainly not the Jim Halpert, handsome guy. I think Stanley would do a good job. But it's actually Oscar is who I would be the actor who plays Oscar is the person I would be most interested in hearing read Mark chapter 2, because there's a little bit of shiftiness required when we hear what Jesus is doing here. Because the religious authorities are accusing him of some pretty bad stuff, like blasphemy. That's not something in the first century you wanted to be accused of. You could get, killed for that sort of thing. And so when they come to Jesus and they confront him, he's being shifty. He's being elusive, right? He's messing with them. And I find this character, this nature of Jesus. I have a friend named Pete Rollins. Pete's much shorter than me. He's much thinner than me. He's from Northern Ireland, so he speaks with a deep, like a thick accent. And he's a little bit of a magician. He plays with the words a lot. And so I sometimes like to read passages and pretend that Pete Rollins is playing Jesus and being very elusive. And it just helps me, to have that thick Northern Irish accent to get away from this very sincere and very straightforward and very stately picture of Jesus that gets portrayed. I want you to think of somebody who's less predictable or less likely or a little more quirky to play. So I'm just curious, does anybody have an actor or an actress in their head who would do a good job at playing this kind of a Jesus? Who are you thinking of? Steve Martin. Steve Martin would make a good Jesus, and if this is what we wanted to bring out. Thank you. Anybody else have an actor? Yeah. Yes, I thought about Johnny Depp, but he's become so famous for the Pirates of the, I don't know if you say Caribbean or Caribbean in Idaho, but for his portrayal of Captain Jack Sparrow, but that's the kind of quirkiness that I'm going for, yes. Anybody else have somebody they want to nominate? Yeah. Nicolas Cage, interesting choice. He does have that very dry sort of wit. In his early movies, I really liked his non-method acting, and then eventually he just plays Nicolas Cage in every movie. But yes, I think he would do a good job. Jack Black. Who said Jack Black? Yes, Jack Black would be perfect in this sort of thing. Maybe a too over the top, but you're getting what I'm going for. So as we go through this, Jesus starts saying some really interesting things. And so not only does he do weird stuff, for instance, he's walking out by the sea, this big body of water. Side note, as we continue reading through the Gospel of Mark, the sea, this body of water, becomes a character in the story. So I just want to put a little pin in that. In future weeks, we're going to have to talk about the sea, this body of water, because it plays a very important role in Mark's story. It almost takes on a life of its own. And so we're going to talk about that in a couple weeks, I mean. So he's walking by the sea, and he sees this tax collector. Now you have to know, tax collectors weren't just, they didn't have a bad reputation just because they ripped people off or they charged a little extra for taxes to siphon off, some for themselves. They were traitors. They worked for the foreign occupier. They were Jewish people. Levi is his name. They were Jewish people who worked for the Roman government. They were agents of Satan, if you want to say it that way. They were the bad guys. And you couldn't mess with them because they would report you, right, to the military authority. And so, as angry as you might be with the tax man, there wasn't a lot you could do about it. So they were ostracized. They were unwanted, and it had to be a very solitary existence. And so Jesus is walking by and he sees this tax collector and he says, "Follow me." And the guy does. It's such an interesting thing that Jesus is assembling his team. A couple weeks ago, he called some fishermen, and they're like not well educated. They're not a part of the religious establishment. They don't come with like influence, right? They don't have a big Twitter following or anything like that. They're just fishermen. And Jesus says, "Hey, come follow me." And then the next person he calls is a tax collector who works for the enemy. And so you have to think, what kind of a team is Jesus assembling here as he's calling his disciples? So not only does he call this guy, and it would be one thing if the story said, and the guy had a total change of perspective, and he didn't do bad stuff anymore, and he became a really good guy. But that's not what happens in this story. Jesus ends up going to have dinner with this guy and his friends. And you have to feel the weight in the story of, uh-oh, Jesus isn't keeping his hands clean. He's not staying away from controversy. He's eating with people who live such unclean lives that they can actually make you unclean. This really sits with me because I grew up in a holiness tradition. Anybody grow up in a holiness tradition? Free Methodist, Nazarene, anywhere where you were supposed to keep your life really pure? Okay. Well, it comes with a little bit of baggage. There's an upside to it, but there's also a downside. Part of the downside of this expectation of holy living is called double insulation. Not only were you supposed to live a very good life and keep your hands clean of the filthy things of this world, like rock music and R-rated movies and card games and dancing and stuff, but you also shouldn't hang out with people who do those things. So you stay away from them, and you stay away from people who don't stay away from them. And this is a way of double insulating yourself, right? I get the heart behind it, but when I read the Gospels, Jesus literally does the exact opposite of this. He doesn't just do double insulation, he does no insulation. He goes and eats dinner with these folks in their house. I mean, it really would be one thing if Jesus invited him, say, to Mary and Martha's house, right? But that's not how the story goes. And so I just love this picture of Jesus, that he sits and he eats. And you can tell that the religious authorities, they're none too happy. So not only did he say that he forgave that guy's sins, and he heals people on the Sabbath, so he does things they don't like, he does them on days you're not supposed to do them, and now he's eating with people that they don't approve of, who, by the way, if they're not ceremonially clean, could actually infect him and make him unceremoniously unclean, right? Like that their sin could actually rub off and affect him. It's like, guilty by association, or, if you're in somebody's home who heats by wood smoke, and when you leave, you smell like campfire, right? So being in the house with Levi and his friends, like their pollution or their stink could actually rub off on Jesus and disqualify him from this ministry. And so the religious leaders don't like it very much, and they confront him about it, and he gives them a riddle. So instead of answering their actual question, he gives them a riddle. Well, how can you fast when you're with the bridegroom? What? What are you talking about? And this is why I think like a Danny DeVito or a different character, you could get how odd of a response this is. Like, dude, what does that have to do with anything? And so he dodges their question. Instead of taking on the religious expectations head on, he becomes very elusive and a little bit whimsical, and he avoids the controversy altogether. But then he ends up saying something really profound in verse 17. He says, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners." That's like a really profound, like a proverb or an axiom. It's like a kind of a sentence that you could make almost your life mission, or one of your core values. And it's really profound. What he's saying is, so often our institutions, whether it's religion or politics or the economy, it's one of those things where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So like, in order to get life insurance, you almost have to prove that you don't need it. Like you're really healthy. If you have any physical issues, any illnesses, any problems, then you might not be able to qualify for life insurance when you need it most, right? Like the joke right now is, with mortgage rates as high as they are, you actually need to be able to prove that you don't need a loan from the bank in order to get a house loan, right? It's ironic. Our institutions work this way. Church sometimes works this way. I'll never forget my final year in seminary. I had a professor who said that one of the greatest things we could do on Communion Sundays was deny people the right to take communion if they weren't living a holy life. That if they weren't living right, one of the greatest gifts we could give them is turning them down for communion, denying them the sacraments. And I'm like looking around like, how backwards is this? So, I raised my hand and I said, I'm a little confused. So keep in mind, at the time, I wasn't very sacramental. Like, I just thought these were symbols, right? It's just bread and a cup, and they just represent something else, right? That's the background I come from. But this guy didn't. He actually thought that they become what he called means of grace, right? These become means of grace. These aren't just symbols of bread and the cup, but that when we take them into ourselves by faith, they become the very thing they represent, right? That's called sacramental theology. So this guy was sacramental, and so he was trying to protect the elements from your grubby hands, all right? So I raised my hand, and I began respectfully, but I said, I'm a little confused. You think that these are a means of grace? He said, yeah. And I said, but somebody who was having trouble living up to the standard that you think they should be, right? Living a holy life, don't they need the grace that these symbols and elements are a means of? Don't they need the very thing that you're denying them? Needless to say, we got in a heated argument. I've never argued with a professor before, and it got ugly because I could not wrap my head around the idea that you first had to live a good enough life to qualify to come down and then celebrate the Lord's table, which he believed was a means of grace. No, it's not the healthy who need a doctor. It's the sick, right? If I'm not living up to God's standards or even my own standards, right? Certainly not my parents' standards, then I need what's in this cup. I need the bread of life. And you're denying it to me because you don't think that I'm living a good enough life, which is exactly why I need it. That's what I said, something like that. It didn't go well. It's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. Jesus said, I haven't come to call the righteous, but sinners. And you can just feel like the religious establishment saying, like, that's ridiculous, right? We need to reward the righteous with our best positions and our most of our time. And right, we want to celebrate those who are doing well. And Jesus said, no, they're already doing well. They're fine. I want to focus on those who aren't doing well. And it's just so different than the institutionalized religion that persists, ironically, to this day in Jesus' name. I find it very ironic. So then in verse 21, he says this final thing that I want to talk about because it's such an interesting word picture. He says, no one sews a patch of unshrunken cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins. This problem that Jesus is naming is so fascinating, and it persists to this day, which is that when our institutions, whether that's like, for instance, heterosexual marriage, or the United Methodist Church, or Congress, when our institutions stop working as well as they used to, we, to this day, still think in Band-Aids and patches. Because it's tough to round the corner into both revolution and reformation to say the whole system needs to change. But we're always trying to patch just the hole that we can see that's leaking now, we just want to patch that one part, but we don't want to address the whole system. It's just a chronic short-term thinking that institutions and societies just lend themselves to, is short-term fixes. And so Jesus just names the problem. He says, here's why it doesn't work. If you have a hole in your jeans, and then you go to patch it, and you cut the exact size of that and sew it on, but because that fabric is new, when it shrinks up, it's actually gonna make the problem worse, right? So he uses the wineskins analogy. So wine, if you're Methodist, you may not know this. Wine is fermented grape juice. Some of you, this is gonna be a shocking chemistry lesson. When the fermentation process is going on, there's a chemical reaction of the yeast eating the sugars, and that becomes the alcohol, and it actually grows and shrinks accordingly. So back in the day, they didn't have wine bottles, right? They used wine skins. They're like buckskins, like you would, Davy Crockett, water bottles sort of thing. And so you would put the new wine in, and that way, this fresh wineskin could expand and contract as the chemical reaction happened, and then over time it would actually, sort of harden and become more rigid as the wine aged. So you couldn't reuse, there was no recycling old wineskins, because if you put the new wine in, as it expanded, it would actually crack the hardened leather bag, and you would both ruin the wineskin and all of the wine would leak out, which is a real tragedy. So Jesus uses this analogy, and the reason I love this analogy is that when it comes to institutional thinking, whether that's denominations or democracy, whatever it is we need to address, you have to be aware that a patch on the outside or just a few new ingredients on the inside aren't going to fix the problem. Because once institutional thinking sets in and things become rigid and calcified or cemented, if you want to use that language, and a little more rigid, actually putting new ideas into an old system can actually sometimes ruin both the idea, it gets polluted, and it cracks the system. So you have to start fresh. And this is a huge challenge to the religious establishment, both of Jesus' day, and it turns out our day as well. You can't just patch a problem if the problem is systemic. Because once the systemic issue has worked its way all the way through and has hardened, right? It's become concretized. Little adjustments don't fix the bigger issue. And I love that Jesus just names this so that we as Jesus followers in the decades and centuries to come, we have this permission to ask the question whenever stuff isn't working as well as it used to, or we recognize that there's a group that's being excluded, or a group that's being unheard, or a group that feels very hurt by how we are conducting ourselves, that we can ask the problem, is this a wineskin? Is this a problem of a wineskin? Is it systemic? Or is there a little adjustment that we can make that'll fix the problem? Or is it a much bigger issue? And we're going through something like this as Methodists right now. For years, the bishops of the Western states have turned a blind eye on the issue of same-sex marriage and have committed that any of us who perform a same-sex wedding ceremony won't be prosecuted according to the book of discipline by which we govern ourselves. And that patch is actually causing a much bigger hole to develop, which is that if we as Methodists don't live by our own book of discipline that makes us Methodists, we prove ourselves to be hypocrites. And so our conservative sisters and brothers have called us on this. They said, this is unacceptable. Either change the book of discipline or stop doing it. But if that's the bylaws, if those are the rules, you gotta follow the rules. That's the methods that make us so Methodists. And so by pouring this new wine, right, of same-sex marriage, into an old wineskin, the book of discipline, we have cracked both. And so our conservative sisters and brothers have said, we're out of here. And they're leaving. It's called disaffiliation. And so there's a panic that has set in because not only are our small rural churches closing all over the country, right, like in Shoshone and Caldwell, what's the most recent one? Jerome, thank you. So not only are our little rural churches closing, which is terrible, but some of our more vibrant or more enthusiastic churches are disaffiliating. And this is a wineskin problem that no patch of changing one sentence in a book of discipline is going to fix. It's a much bigger issue. How are we together going to address this thing that we don't agree about? And so 4 years ago, the more progressive churches said, can we just agree to disagree? That we'll let each church decide its own way forward. And the conservatives said, we will not agree to disagree. They said it like that too. And so it's led to this split that makes the evening news all the time. But I don't fault the conservatives, I don't. They're actually doing what's in our book. I fault those of us who thought we could get away with patching a hole in a piece of fabric, thinking that would fix the problem, to turn a blind eye so that we could do what we wanted to without consequence. And we caused a much bigger tear by not living up to our own standard. So I love that Jesus just names the difference between a quick fix and a much bigger systemic issue.